Good day to you. And what's your system for getting up in the morning and getting ready for the day? Everybody has a system, things that they regularly do to make sure that they can function during the day. Some people, when they wake up, they have to hit the alarm 2 or 3 times because it takes them a while to come out of their grogginess. Others hop right into the shower. For me, I come down into my kitchen and I walk across the kitchen, and the first thing that I'm looking forward to is that newspaper that's landed on the porch of my house. And so I open that door, and there it is. If it's not there, my morning feels kind of interrupted. I rely on that newspaper not just for the content in the paper. I rely on that newspaper because it's part of my whole morning routine. I'm going to put it down on the counter here. Then I'm going to get myself some food for breakfast, probably some fruit. Somebody ate the honeydew melon last night, so instead I'm going to have that watermelon there. And I lay it out next to the newspaper, and the newspaper and what I'm having for breakfast, they go together. And that starts off my morning. Then later I'm going to go up and take a shower. And so it's that way that we also approach media in this book, comparing media from around the world. Because we're taking a look at media as it belongs to a system. And really what we're doing in today's chapter 3 on elements of a media system, is we're taking a look at the rest of the book. In other words, today's instructor video is really a preview for the rest of the class. So let's talk in more detail about what a system is, because it's a pretty theoretical thing. A system is a methodological approach. It's a way of studying something in a systematic manner. And the system is the way that I've chosen to break down the subject matter for this book and, in fact, for the course. What is a system? A system is a collection of interrelated parts that cause the whole, which in this case is going to be a media system, to function. These parts are in motion. They're constantly changing. So just like if that newspaper wasn't there today, it's going to be affecting other parts of my day. Just like if there was no fruit in the fridge, which I like to have every morning, that's going to affect parts of my day. And the same is true for media as well, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. What also makes up a system is that each part of the system influences each other. If one thing changes, or if one thing it becomes more important, then it affects other parts of the system. Also, a system relies on a wide range of resources to function. You have to be able to pull from what is available, financial resources, human resources, equipment resources, knowledge resources, to make a system like a media system function. And finally, a system is constantly undergoing change. It's got an organic element to it. It's always changing. It's never static, never staying the same. Now, within a system, you have variables, things that are changing all the time. That's what I've been alluding to so far in this instructor video. And in the case of the book, I chose the word elements to describe those variables in a media system that we're going to be taking a look at this semester. The variables are the fundamental components of a system. In this case, they are elements. So the elements are the fundamental components. Without them, the system does not exist. Furthermore, the elements relate to each other. One element is closely tied to the way another element is formed. And so if one element changes, another element is also affected by that. There's a domino effect. Also, some elements have a greater influence on the system than others. Using the breakfast example once again, fruit has a big effect on me if I eat it in the morning, if you know what I mean. Whereas if I'm forced to eat bread or something, my system functions very differently. And the same is true of media, and we're going to be talking about those elements in a few minutes, and I want you to consider what is one element that is going to be bigger than the others as I mention them, and then I'll tell you what I think, and that's what I've identified as the element in the book that is the biggest element of all in the system. Then next up is one element or two elements can sometimes illustrate the other elements. That is to say that you sometimes have to look at an element to see the other elements. If you can't look at one element, you can't see the other elements. Again, more about that in a minute. Actually, more about that right now, because the next thing I turn to in the chapter is the element of content. Before I mention any of the other elements, I want to highlight content because media content is that element that has a bigger effect on the system than any other element. Media content is also that element by which we can look to examine other elements. And so what I mean by that is we are able to look at Financing, for example, it's one other element of a media system that we're going to be studying very shortly in this class. How media systems are paid for, in other words. We can look at content to figure out how media systems are paid for. In other words, the element of content illuminates financing for us. If we don't look at content, we can't see financing at all. Now, before I mention the elements, I want to again bring up this idea that this book operates from a rhetorical perspective. A rhetorical perspective, we said earlier, has to do with understanding the meaning of media systems. And in this case, what I'm trying to do is develop that idea to say that rhetorical perspectives allows us to have reasonable interpretations of media systems. That is to say that when we take a look at, for example, a remote control, is it reasonable to assume that as you click up through the channels on your remote control, that the channels that you come to earlier in that process are going to be more likely to be watched by you than channels up in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s, unless you're specifically going for ESPN, for example, and you know that's on channel 30. Is it reasonable to assume that if you're just wandering, you're going to start with channel 2, and you're going to go up, and channel 3 will be more likely to be viewed by you than channel 26? If you agree with that, then you're signing on to this idea that this book has a rhetorical perspective. It's not to say that for sure people are going to be more likely to watch channel 2 than channel 35. It's just saying it's a reasonable interpretation. And that's what I want you to consider as we go throughout this course and I make observations about other countries' media systems. What is reasonable to assume in terms of the audience's interpretation about those elements of the media systems that we're talking about? Now, speaking of elements, in this book I use the metaphor of a tree. There are many trees right behind me here. The tree I use as a way of describing how the elements look. The tree is a kind of a graphic. It's a kind of a model. It gives a visual depiction of what would otherwise be an abstract subject, which already you've probably already considered this class to be, at least this particular day, is quite abstract when we're talking about systems and elements, etc. So when I use the metaphor of a tree, I'm trying to bring a visual depiction to people when they think about elements of a media system. And so here's how the elements of the media systems that we're going to be studying in this book are going to break down, and each of these elements forms the chapters as we go forward from this point forward, and also the tree helps to bring these elements into a visual representation. So the first element that we're going to be turning to is going to be the next chapter, and that's the chapter on cultural characteristics. And I use the idea that cultural characteristics exist below the earth. There's a tree behind me over there, but you don't see what's underneath the ground. You probably wouldn't believe this unless you know trees, but you're only looking at half of that tree right now. The other half is underground. Yeah, there's a whole other half of that tree that you can't see. The roots are feeding into that other half. The roots are the other half, I should say, underground. It doubles the size of the tree. So the cultural characteristics I liken to the soil that surrounds the tree. It provides the nutrients and the basic ingredients that give the tree its color and its shape and its form and its hue. And so that's what cultural characteristics are. It's the soil that surrounds the tree roots. Then we have philosophies, another idea of a media system that's underground, which is to say you have to go digging to get to those philosophies. They're not going to just jump at you, the philosophy of the American media system, the philosophy of the Chinese media system. You have to dig down underneath to find them. And when you do, the roots of a tree are representing those philosophies. The philosophies set up the outlook for how a media system should operate. And we'll be talking about those after we talk about cultural characteristics. Moving on to the next element of the media system, we're going to talk about regulation. Regulation now is the first time that we can see the part of the tree that's above the ground. It's the trunk of the tree. It's the one big solid piece that holds the whole tree up, gives it again its sturdiness, also gives it its balance. Everything else is piled on top of the regulations, just like that tree and behind me is piled on top of that tree stump. Regulations are normally coming from government, but there are other areas that regulations are coming from as well, and that's the next chapter that we turn to after philosophies, and it's another element. After that, we move on to the element of financing. Financing is how media systems are paid for. Financing is represented on that tree and the tree in the book as the bigger branches that are coming out from the trunk. Financing is how the media are paid for. There's a number of ways that you can pay for media. In this country, most media are paid by advertising or paid for by advertising, but in other countries there are other methods of financing, some really interesting ones, and we're going to talk about those. After financing comes accessibility. That's the next element, accessibility. Those are the smaller branches on a tree. Accessibility carries the leaves out to people who pass by a tree and animals that pass by a tree. It's what gives the tree its sort of final destination in terms of its shape. And so accessibility has to do with how easy is it to get to media content within your system. Do you have to pay for it? Do you have to have special technology like a digital box to view it? Is accessibility easy for the branches on the bottom of the tree because you can reach them, but the branches on the top of the tree you can't? That's accessibility, and we'll be talking about it in terms of a media system. And then the next element that we talk about is the one that I've introduced all of the elements with. It's the most important element. It's media content. And that's what most of our focus is going to be on in this book. In order to understand all these elements, we got to keep looking at media content. That's why we spend a little bit more time on that subject matter, that element, that we do on the others. And then after media content, you have a particular type of media content, which I divide into its own element, and it is the news reporting. Whereas content is represented by the leaves in the tree, it's the first thing you see, right? When you look at that tree behind me, you're probably not looking at the trunk, you're looking at the leaves. That's because content is the most foreground element of the media system. It's how you see the other system. But within those leaves, there are leaves that are slightly discolored, have a slightly different sheen to them, have a slightly different shape to them. Those unusual leaves are what I liken to the news reporting in a media system. It's how you tell the health of a tree, just like how you tell the health of a media system by looking at the news reporting in that system. That's another element that we'll be talking about. Then we have only two more elements that we'll be studying in this class, the next of which is what I refer to as imports and exports. Imports and exports are the media that are exported from your particular home country's system to another country. Like if you go into Canada, can you pick up a USA Today? If you can, that newspaper is an export from the United States going into Canada. Imports, on the other hand, are media that are coming into your country. And so when you go to watch TV, what shows are on television that are from other countries? When you go to surf on the web, what content are you seeing that's come from somewhere outside of the United States? That's imports and exports, and I represent that in our tree metaphor as the seedlings that come out of a tree, because when they release from the tree, the wind blows them to other areas, and they go over and they root up in those areas, and they sprout their own media systems. That's the second to last element in this book. And then the final element is us. It's the audiences. It's the people who take in media content. And I refer to those people as the passers-by of a tree, people who walk up next to the tree and decide to pick that apple, or to gaze at a branch, or to try and reach high up on the tree to pull down a leaf. Those are the audience members that are reaching into media systems and are also being reached by media systems. So this then sums up what this chapter is all about. It's about media systems. It's serving as a way forward for us in this book and also in this class as we begin to dissect media systems. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go take my shower. Otherwise, my day's not going to be complete. Have a great day yourself.